L'chaim. So number one, the first thing we want to talk about is that these laws in Maimonides derive from the Mishnah and the Talmud. And which section do they come from in the Mishnah and the Talmud? So there is a section, there's really three sections in, my video off. Cool. I don't know what's going on here. Do you hear me? Does anybody hear me, or is it?
We can
It's
hear
perfect, Rabbi. We can hear
Okay,
you.
you
We can
can
see you.
Okay, perfect. So there are really three sections in the Talmud that discuss monetary law. And generally, it is now divided into three sections. But initially, it was called nizikin, which is damages. And then it was divided into the names of three tractates because it's a very long tractate. It would have been more than 30 chapters. So it was divided by, a long time ago. In other words, in Talmudic times, it was divided into three tractates. And you may have heard it. The name's in Aramaic. They're called Baba Kama, which means in Aramaic for the first gate. And then you have the second gate, and then you have the third gate. So there are three gates. The reason why it's called gates is because that basically it's the three sections of dividing the laws of damages. But damages, it's really monetary law, really. It's monetary law. And if you want to think about it, so of course I'm generalizing, but I just want to go over quickly what the difference with three gates carry, discuss. And I'm just trying to get to the third gate, which is what we are discussing right now. So the third gate is called Baba Kama, the first gate, and it opens with questions of damages. So this is clear. I damage you. Obviously, there's compensation in certain cases, and the question is, what is the extent of my responsibility if I damage you, or if my property damages you, or I cause you to be damaged directly? So that's called the Mishnah starts with Arba'a Avot Nizikin. There are four father categories, literally four fathers, but four general categories of damages. And then the entire chapter proceeds to enumerate the various types of damages. So that's clear. We know who's there's a villain, there is somebody who's damaging the other, and then the question is, how much do they have to pay, or in what cases do they have to pay? So that's gate number one. Gate number two is there are other responsibilities that I have toward somebody else, even if I did not actually damage them. And the best example for gate number two would be something that's discussed at length in the second gate is, for example, there are laws of mitzia, found objects. If I find your object, okay? Here, it's taking it to the next step. Not only I have a financial responsibility or a moral obligation, but in the Torah, it becomes like almost a legal obligation, or, it's a mitzvah. So there's an obligation for me to return a lost object to you, even though I'm not responsible for the fact that you lost it. It's not my problem. So in the first gate, yeah, I understand. I have to pay because I caused I caused damage. In the second gate, I didn't cause damage, but I am still obligated. I still have a financial and monetary obligation towards you in the case of returning lost objects and the like. There's obviously 10 chapters, so there's a lot to discuss. So that's generally the second gate. The third gate begins with the concept of neighbors. And here I'm not even damaging you in some cases. But the question becomes, how do we use, if we're neighbors, then inevitably there's going to be some common ground and some common property and some common partnership, spoken or unspoken, and how do we navigate those interactions? And it covers all kinds of, from there it branches off to all kinds of laws. What about laws of partners? Partners, we're not literal neighbors, but we chose in some way to become partners. So what's the laws? How do we become partners? How do we dissolve partnerships in a civil and productive way? So you see that in the third gate is even, it's taking the next step. It's actually, in other words, in some sense, there's less, in the first step, I damaged you. In the first gate, I damaged you. Second gate, I didn't damage you, but you have a loss. And I could help protect you against a loss. In the third gate, it's not even a loss. It's just regulating how are people supposed to live together in peace and harmony. And the famous statement is that, the famous idea is that good fences make good neighbors. And therefore, it's no surprise that the first Mishnah discusses, the first Mishnah in the tractate, and Maimonides is, of course, taking from that tractate and discussing the concept of, okay, we have to make a fence. Who makes the fence? Who has to pay for the fence? Who owns the fence? Et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to discuss laws of fences because, again, laws of fences is an important part of the discussion between neighbors. So that's sort of just a general overview of what's happening in the third tractate of Bava Metzia, and therefore in the section of Maimonides that we're going to discuss called Hilchot Shchenim, the laws of neighbors. But before we go before we go to the law, we want to stay a little mystical for a moment. And this is something that, the Rebbe spoke about and others speak about. Fascinating idea. So if you look at the opening statement of the Mishnah, and you'll see as well that it's also the opening statement of Maimonides in this section, the discussion is we're partners and we want to break up the partnership for whatever reason. So it could be we're partners, we own a cow together, we can own a field together, we can own a courtyard together, we're neighbors, so we share the same backyard, and one of us want to separate. And the question becomes, how do I separate? Or more importantly, can I force you to break up the partnership, or do I need your consent? Could one person unilaterally force the breaking up of the partnership? That's the opening question of the tractate of Baba Batra, the final gate. Also the opening discussion of Maimonides, the laws of witnesses. The laws of neighbors. Okay, so I ask you, is this a good thing? Should people separate? Should people try to break up partnerships? Okay, if anybody wants to jump in, is it a good thing? Is the Mishnah happy? The Mishnah tells a story that we're partners who want to separate, who want to make a wall between them. There were neighbors who wanted to make a wall between them. Is that a good idea or a bad idea? That is a question to be asked. It's not a question the Mishnah asks, but it's a question to be asked. And the answer is, okay, before we go to the answer, let's look at the final Mishnah of the tractate. Again, we're in the third tractate. We're talking about people and neighbors and partners. So the first Mishnah is, we're talking about a scenario where there are neighbors who decide we've been living on this land together. We've been sharing our beautiful backyard together. And all of a sudden, one of us decides to put up a fence and wants to separate the ownership. And that can create tension. I know that we had a scenario. We had when we moved into our home, and we decided for safety reasons we want to put up a fence, and we put up a fence for safety reasons. And there were other people that living in this vicinity that weren't happy with our fence, and we're not happy with the fence until now. They're not so happy. But that's life, Neighbors are going to live together. Different people have different perspectives on how the land should be used. And the question becomes, how do I use my rights without imposing on your rights? Okay, but whatever the case is, the Mishnah says, all I'm saying is this is very practical in 21st century as well. But in any case, so I decide one of us decide they want to put up a fence. That's the first, we want to break, in a sense, it's breaking up partnership. It's not just using a fence, because as we will discuss, in the scenario is we both use this land together. So we have my house and your house on the same piece of property, and we both use the yard together. Both of us used all parts of the yard together for years. All of a sudden, one party says, you know what, I had enough. I want my own privacy. I'm putting up a wall. I'm separating. You take half, I take half. Could we do that? That's the question. Fine. So then we're going to discuss how this is done or if it could be done, etc. Then we're going to skip many, many chapters. I think it's about 10 chapters. And then we get to the final Mishnah in the tractates. And the final Mishnah of the tractate is the laws of what they call in Hebrew an arev. An arev is guarantor. So the guarantor would mean that I want to borrow money from somebody, but that person knows that they're not sure that I'm going to be able to pay back. So they tell me they'll pay. They will loan me the money if I can produce somebody. If somebody will take responsibility for the loan and be the guarantor, and commit to pay back and commit to pay back if I cannot pay. That's the concept of an arev. That's the concept of someone who's a guarantor for somebody else. And now the Mishnah discusses all kinds of scenarios because there are different types of guarantors. There's one guarantor that becomes the guarantor at the moment the loan takes place. So I come to you and I say, can I borrow $50? And you say, I'm only going to give you $50 if there's a guarantor. And I have to produce the guarantor. So that's one scenario of the guarantor. But then there's another scenario. Another scenario is that the guarantor becomes the guarantor, not at the moment of the loan, but at the moment that the creditor is trying to collect. So I'm walking down the street and you see me and you know I owe you $50. So you come to me and you say, pay me. And I say, I'm sorry, I have no money. You say, I'm not letting go. You have to pay me. I'm going to schlep you to court. So there's a nice Jew walking by, and the Jew tells the creditor, don't worry, if he can't pay you, I'll pay you. So this is a different scenario. He became a guarantor, he committed not at the moment of the loan, but at the moment when it came time to repay. So there's all kinds of laws about the guarantor. So now, if we're taking a mystical look, let's look up at the progression of the tractate. Beginning of the tractate, we discussed two people that want to separate. Okay, you have the legal right to separate. You have the legal right to privacy. You have the legal right to private property. There's no problem. You want to separate, there's no problem. Like they say in Russian, I think, pajalista. I don't know what that means, but it means like, sure, go ahead, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong. So if you want to separate, you're welcome to separate. But that is just the beginning of the tractate. Over time, we advance spiritually, and you get to the point where a person is willing to be a guarantor for somebody else. That's much more than just a partnership, right? Because a partnership is, I'm a partner, I'm part owner, I get certain usage, I share some, I get some. When it comes to a guarantor, the guarantor is not really getting anything in return for being a guarantor. It's just that he's committed and he cares about the other person. So it's much more than a partner. So we start out with scenario where there are neighbors that want to separate. Okay, the legal rights, they can separate, wonderful. But then we continue and we progress throughout the tractate. We get to the point of discussing the laws of somebody who would want to become a guarantor for somebody else. Obviously, from the perspective of the Torah, that is the ideal. So while I have the right to separate, but the purpose again, but again, spiritually speaking, the more I see myself as a partner, as concerned for somebody else, the better it is. So you get that from the progression of the tractate. So again, we're talking about law. So in law, it's not only about what the spiritual thing to do is. The law is about what are my legal rights and what are my legal responsibilities, and that's what we're going to discuss. But we also want to listen out for, is the Mishnah telling us anything, even in the way it even in the way it sets up the order of the tractate, and maybe the Mishnah is hinting that it would be nice. You have the right for everyone to be separate all the time, but you can achieve much more if people coexist and if people create partnerships and create corporations and work together, and much more can be achieved. So that is the introduction. I know we started late and we had a long introduction, but hopefully it's a few minutes to actually study some Torah on this wonderful, wonderful Tuesday morning after the Simchat Torah, after the joy of the Torah. Now we get back to the books. Enough dancing, back to the books. I'm only half kidding. Okay. If anybody has any comments or questions, please go ahead. Otherwise, we continue and we go straight to Maimonides.
Rabbi, I have actually 2 or 3 real life examples, but I can
Okay.
wait and ask about them at the end. It has to do with my father and his neighbors.
Right.
Should I ask them at the end?
Yeah, maybe better to ask them at the end. But again,
Okay.
there's some of this stuff that we're discussing now cannot be applied so easily to the 21st century in the United States of America, because a lot of it is based on local custom. So that would change based on the different society. However, even though not all of the laws could be transferred and could be applied in today's day and age, but certainly there are going to be certain values that should be carried over. So first we're going to discuss the law the way it was in the ancient world, and then we'll discuss, can any of this be applied to the modern world, and what values can we derive and what values can we apply? If you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, these were not, that I'll save it for the end. These were not actually legal disputes. It was
Right.
really interesting the way they resolve certain
Right. Okay. Yes. I would love to. I would love to hear. Let's do that in 10, 12 minutes. Okay.
Okay.
But again, this is an important introduction in general, that not everything we're going to learn in this Mishnah could be applied, could be copy and pasted to how I should behave in the modern world. You'll see clearly that there are differences and the expectations are different. Everything is different, but nonetheless, there certainly is. You still want to discuss the Talmudic scenario, and then figure out what can we glean from that scenario. If you see what I'm saying. Okay, so here is the case. The case is you have partners and both own a field. You own a field in partnership. How do you own a field in partnership? There are many ways you can own a field in partnership. Maimonides is going to spell them out. But I own a field in partnership. Now the question is, I want to break up the partnership. And the question is, could I do it, or could it be done, and therefore could it be done, and therefore how could it be done? That's the questions we want to discuss. Now I want to give a little introduction. I'm sorry for giving another introduction. In general, in American law, if I understand correctly, I don't think we have any lawyers on the phone right now, but I may be wrong. But if I understand correctly, it's not so easy to dissolve a partnership. In other words, when you make a partnership, the document or the legal document or legal agreement has to have an escape hatch, has to have an exit strategy. There has to be spelled out a way where either party can dissolve the partnership if they so desire. But let's say you wrote up a partnership and you did not explicitly state how the partnership should dissolve. It's not so easy to get out of a partnership. And in some cases, you would need the consent of both parties. So it's not so simple. And you'll see here, I don't think we'll see it today, but yeah, you'll see it today. You will see it today, that in many cases in Jewish law, it's much easier to dissolve a partnership. And not only is it easier, but we also have efficient ways to determine how it should be done. In other words, part of the problem with dissolving a partnership is, how do you value the monetary value of this possession? So we have a partnership, we have a business. How much is the business worth? It's not so easy to determine unless you're going to sell it, but not always do you want to sell it. So these are problems of how do you figure out the value of the thing that you're trying to dissolve, and then be able to one party buy out the other party or whatever it is. So Judaism has the Talmudic law has, relatively speaking, has a relatively liberal way. In other words, easier to separate and easier to determine how to separate. So we're going to discuss that as we go through the chapter. But it's interesting, and in some ways, I have my explanation is not that Judaism encourages less partnership than American law, because Judaism, partnership should be nice. It's a nice thing. People can pool their resources together, and they could probably achieve more than one person could achieve on their own. But I think what's happening here is that the best way to encourage partnership is if people know that they can partner And then when they need to, they'll be able to get out, right? So it's interesting that sometimes providing the way out is actually encouraging the partnership. Whereas if you say we love partnerships and therefore we're going to make it very hard to dissolve the partnership, the unintended consequence is that nobody's going to want to become partners, right? So sometimes you have to actually weaken the institution of partnership in order to actually strengthen and encourage the institution of partnership. So I think that's what's happening here with this Mishnah, with this concept of Mishnah, and as well as Maimonides. So here we're gonna have it in the English here. You can follow along on the link I sent. Otherwise, you could just listen. We're going to be the introduction to the laws, and then we're going to do section 1. We'll see how many paragraphs we get through. I don't anticipate to get very far, but we'll try. We'll see how far we get. So, says Maimonides, this is an introduction to the Hilchot Shchenim, which is the laws of neighbors. And Maimonides spells out what he seeks to achieve with in these laws. In other words, Maimonides did not copy and paste from the Mishnah. He reorganized the Talmud based on topic, which is not always, the Talmud doesn't always discuss, the Talmud does not always discuss the all topics in an organized manner. It's very organic. So there could be even if the main discussion of partners and laborers is in one tractate, but some of the laws can appear in many, many other tractates. So Maimonides really collects all the laws that have the same theme, and he puts it into one section. And now he defines what the meaning of that section is, what the purpose of the section is. So here we go. The purpose of these laws is to know the proper way to divide land among partners. In other words, if partners want to dissolve the partnership, how do I divide the land? How one should remove factors that may cause danger to one's neighbor and those upon whom one's property borders. In other words, I have a property. Can I do anything on my property? Can I produce noise? Can I produce smoke that will then interfere with the other person's property? So that's what we're going to discuss. How do I use my own property in a way that to protect the rights, not only my own rights, but the rights of my neighbor? And the laws concerning the privileges granted to a person upon whose land one's property borders. And this is fascinating. If my land borders your land, I have certain privileges, certain rights in your land, as we will discuss. So this can get interesting. These laws are explained in the chapters that follow. And there is no less than, there's actually 14 chapters that discuss and regulate the laws of Shchenim, the laws of neighbors. So here we go. We'll jump right in because I don't want to give any more introductions. I can do more introductions, but I want to actually study a little bit. So here we go. The following rules apply when a person purchases half of a field from a colleague. What Maimonides is doing now is spelling out some of the scenarios where we can end up that both of us own a field together. So how do both of us own a field together? One way is if I buy half a field from my friend. So you own a field, you need cash. So you come to me and you say, do you want 50% of my field? I say, yes, I pay you the money. And now we both own this field together. That's one scenario. Another scenario, two people together purchase a field from a colleague, right? It's not that I buy from the owner. Me and you want to buy, I want to buy, somebody puts up a for sale sign on his land, $100 for this piece of land. I can't afford $100. So I come to you, I say, how about we both buy this land together? I pay $50, you pay $50. That's another scenario where two people can be partners in the same land. Next case, they both inherited a field. So what about if you have two siblings or two relatives that inherit a field together? So now we both own the land, and now it's up to us whether we want to divide it. But again, these are scenarios where two people will own a field, will own a piece of land together. A field was given to them as a gift. Another scenario, somebody wants to gift us a field, but he doesn't give it to me, he gives it to me and my brother, or and my cousin, or my neighbor. Now we're stuck. We both own land together. Okay, it's good to own land, but having partners and managing partners sometimes is not such an easy scenario, especially if it's with your family. That can be a cause of a lot of trouble. Or they took possession of ownerless land or property belonging to a convert who died without having Jewish heirs. So there's two ways. Another way where two people can own land together, there's something called hefker. Hefker is ownerless. It's his ownerless land. How land becomes ownerless is another story, but let's assume there's ownerless land. and then both of us take possession of the land together. So we both own the land. Another scenario of a hefker, of an ownerless land, is if somebody dies and the person has no heirs. There's no one who will inherit him. He doesn't have any heirs. Why doesn't he have any heirs? Because every Jew must have a relative. If you're Jewish, you have a Jewish relative. So the answer is the person is a convert. And if he's a convert and he dies and he doesn't have any Jewish relatives, then there's a scenario where we don't know who his relatives are because he doesn't have any Jewish relatives. And then in some sense, his land is ownerless. And if two people take possession of that land together, they become partners. These laws, i.e. any situation in which two people own land in partnership. So the first paragraph of section 1 is defining different scenarios where, for whatever reason, both of us own land together. Now the question becomes, one of us want to separate. Okay? And now, like I said, the question becomes, I don't know, do I have the right to impose? Do I need both people to agree? So Maimonides is going to lay out the law here, but he's not going to explain it. And he says, if this is a land that you could separate, it has the law of separation, which we'll define that later. But it's a land that could be separated. If it's a land that could be separated, could be divided, then any one person could force the dissolving of the partnership and force the land to be divided. If this is a land that for whatever reason cannot be, if this is something, it could be land, it could be anything. If there's something that cannot be divided, but practically speaking, it cannot be divided, as we will discuss those scenarios later. But if it's something that cannot be divided, then the party cannot force the dissolving of the partnership unilaterally. So we'll discuss those cases, but I think a vast majority of the cases are cases where something could be, does have, what in the language of the Talmud, language of Maimonides, does have a din chalukah, does have a law of partnership, meaning to say it's possible to be divided. So this is the takeaway. If the land could be divided, any one party could impose and force the division. And like I said, this sounds like common sense, but it's not like that in the American system of law. In the American system of law, if I understand correctly, in most states, if I understand correctly, if you're dissolving a partnership and you didn't have an agreement of how this partnership should be dissolved, it's not so simple to divide it. Both parties must agree, I think. Okay, so here we go. Second to last paragraph on the first page, second paragraph of section 1. If one of the partners asks to divide the property and take his portion alone, and the property is large enough to be divided, that is the English translation of what the Talmud says and what Maimonides says. It has a din chalukah. It has a law of division. It's possible for it to be divided, and we'll define what that would mean. But if it could be divided, we compel the other partners to divide the property with him. Right? I'm only a minority stakeholder. Let's say I have one field. We have 10 brothers. We all own the field together. We all inherited the field together. If this is something that could be divided, we divide it. One person wants it divided, they could divide it. They can force the others to divide. If the property is not large enough to be divided, neither partner can require the other one to divide the property. Similar laws applied with regard to movable property. In other words, this is not only about a field, but it's also about movable property. If it's something that is large enough, it could be if it's a field that's large enough to be divided, one party wants to divide it, it could be divided. He can compel the others to divide it. But if it's something that cannot be divided, if it's a field means it's too small, as we'll define it, then you cannot compel the others to divide. And the same is true about movable property. Movable property has nothing to do about the size. We'll discuss how do you define the din chalukah, how you define something that's divisible if it's a movable property. But the bottom line is the law is clear. If it's divisible, same law. If it's something that is potentially that is able to be divided, then one party can force the division. If not, then one cannot. And we're going to do, I guess we'll read another few lines and we'll finish the section 1. When does the above apply? When neither of the parties recognizes a specific portion of the property they share as his own, but rather both use the entire property equally. If, however, one of the partners recognizes a portion of the property as his own, each one has the right to compel the other partner to make a divider between the portions and his colleague's portion, although the property is not large enough to be divided. So we're going to discuss the scenario, but what we're saying here is, if for whatever reason we're talking about a scenario where everybody owns it, but everybody uses a specific slice of this property, then even if it's not large enough to be divided, I could force the division. Any one party can force the division, because we don't need a division because everybody already knows what they use. So let me give you an example for this. The example is if we are both our homes open up to the same yard, and the yard is very small, so it's not big enough to be divided, as we will discuss next week, God willing. But it just has become the custom that you use the few feet that are in front of your door, and I use the few feet that are in front of my door. That's the way we use it. In other words, even though legally we both own the entire land, but practically each one uses a specific part of that land. You use the few feet that are in front of your door, and I use the few feet that are in front of my door. And since that's the case, that's what the Talmud, that's what Maimonides calls. This is something that every individual owner recognizes the portion that he uses, and they don't overlap, because I don't use the space in front of your door, and you don't use the space in front of my door. In that scenario, even if the land is not big enough to be divided, as we will discuss what that means, even if the land is not big enough to divide it, we can compel each other. One party can compel the other party to divide the land. And in this case, what would divide the land mean? Not only does it mean that I don't want you stepping in my property, but I could compel that we build a wall or a fence to give us privacy. And this is also something that's going to be very important in the next sections, that in the Talmud, going back 2,000 years, there is a right to privacy in one's own, not only one's own home, but even one's property. There's something called hezek re'iyah. I could damage you by looking at your property, because if I look at your property, in some cases, I'm depriving you of usage of your property, because then there are going to be certain activities that you won't do out in the open, and you'll only do it if you have a sense of privacy. And therefore, if I keep looking at your property, I'm going to deprive you of a certain usage. And that's why, under certain circumstances, like I said, if the field is big enough, but even if the field is not big enough, if it's clear which section is yours, which section you use, and which section I use, one party can compel the other to build a fence, build a mechitza. Mechitza is, we know mechitza from a divider in shul, but a mechitza means a fence that would provide privacy, because the right to privacy is important to Judaism, as we will discuss. Unfortunately, we ran out the clock, so we'll continue section 2, halacha 2, the second paragraph, next week. But thank you for joining, and again, I apologize for the technical difficulty. If anybody has any questions, and we also want to hear Beth's